right, we are on our last section for our operations with sign numbers. The last ones that we're going to look at is multiplying and dividing sign numbers. This comes from section 9.3 of the book. Now, we saw with addition and subtraction that one of the challenges was sometimes we added, sometimes we subtracted. A plus sign did not always mean add, a minus sign did not always mean subtract. And so that was one of the challenges with addition and subtraction. Now, multiplication and division is a lot easier in terms of our computations. Regardless of what our signs are, if it's a multiplication problem, you multiply. And if it's a division problem, you divide. So our first step is going to be multiply or divide the numbers. Again, we're going to do this disregarding signs. Now with addition and subtraction, we also saw that determining the sign of the answer was also a little complicated. Sometimes you kept the sign, sometimes you kept the sign of the larger number, and so we ran into all sorts of issues with that. With multiplication and division, again, this is easier to remember. Our rule is if there is an even number of negatives, for instance, 2, 4, 6, our result is always going to be positive. If there is an odd number of negatives, the result is negative. One thing you can do is you can pair them up. If you can pair them up, they make a positive sign. If you have a negative left over that does not pair up with another negative, then it stays negative. Now, what's a way to remember this? Now, if you are working with two numbers, we can use the karma rule. And the karma rule says this: when good things happen to good people, it's a good thing. So a positive times a positive is equal to a positive. The second statement we have is when bad things happen to good people, it's a bad thing. So a negative times a positive is a negative. Now we are all good people, so I'm sure that we agree with these statements. If you're not a good person, then you might not like the next two. The next two says, when good things happen to bad people, it's a bad thing. Which brings me to my story. I have this person that I know, and went to a party and found out that she was dating this guy that seemed really, really great. And I was single at the time. And when I went home, I called all my friends, or quite a few, and said, what is wrong with this world that this person who I don't like and who I do not consider a good person winds up with this great guy? I don't understand what is wrong with the world. So when good things happen to bad people, it's a bad thing. So a couple weeks later, I go down and I'm visiting a mutual friend. And so I ask them, is she still dating the guy? And I'm told no. But it's in a tone that I know there's more to the story than that. And so I asked, well, what happened? And so my mutual friend looked at me and said, his wife showed up wanting to know where he was at 5 o'clock in the morning. So I got to go home and I called all of my friends and I said, the world is right again. they're no longer together, and I explained the reason, and we all had a good laugh about it. So when bad things happen to bad people, it's a good thing. If you want to go with more traditional examples, when murderers go to jail, murderers are bad people. Going to jail is considered a bad thing. Well, when they go to jail, it's a good thing. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into some examples and see what we do. All right, so now one of the first things that I want to point out is in the previous sections, we saw parentheses. And we do want to be very careful when we talk about parentheses meaning multiplication. So when do parentheses mean multiplication and when don't they? For instance, on all of these examples here that have the parentheses, notice that there is no operation between our number and our number in front and the parentheses. This signifies that it is multiplication. Whereas if we had a plus sign or a minus sign or even a division sign, then that means we need to use whatever operation is there. So be very careful on problems like that. Make sure that you are not multiplying when you should be adding or subtracting and vice versa. All right, so let's go ahead and see what we can do here. Example A. We have -2 times 8. The first thing that I want to do is multiply my numbers. We get 16. We have a single negative in our problem. We keep it. And we're done. If we look at example B, we get 10 times 6 is 60. I can cancel my two negatives, leaving me with no negative sign, so my answer is positive 60. Example C, if we multiply 9 times 11, we get 99. We have a single negative in our problem, so we keep it. Example D, we have -5 times -5. 5 times 5 is 25. My two negatives cancel, leaving me with positive 25. All right, let's look at examples E through H. These are going to be ones where we have several numbers involved. So this is where you need to know your rules in terms of, is there an even number of negatives or an odd number of negatives? This is not going to be same signs, different signs. So it's all about how many are there. So if we look at example E, the first thing I want to do is I want to multiply inside the parentheses. -10 times 2 is -20. And if we multiply 5 times -20, we get 5 times 20 is 100. I have one negative, and so it's going to equal -100. Example F. I'm going to go ahead and multiply from left to right. And I'm just going to multiply the numbers. We'll come back to the signs in a minute. 3 times 2 is 6, times 4. This is equal to 24. Now for my signs, again, can I pair them up? So let's see here, we got these two pair up, but I have one left over that cannot pair up with anything, so we keep it with the answer. All right, let's look at G. We're going to start inside the parentheses. 7 times 3, I get 21. I'm going to multiply that by 2, and we get 42. Okay, what about my negatives? My two negatives cancel, meaning that my answer is positive 42. And finally, example H, I'm going to go ahead and go from left to right. Negative 1 times 8, or 1 times 8 is 8, times 5 is 40. My negative signs cancel, leaving me with positive 40. Now, if you want, you can put your negatives in your computations. It doesn't really matter, okay? But for me personally, always go back at the end and make sure that, that you're correct in whether it is a positive or negative value. Note that it doesn't matter what number is larger, what number is smaller. It's all about how many negatives are in the problem. All right, let's look at some division problems. So example I, we have 40 divided by negative 8. 40 divided by 8 is 5. I have one negative in my problem, and so my answer will be negative 5. Example J, negative 32 divided by 4. 32 divided by 4 is 8. I have one negative in my problem, and so I'm going to keep it. We get negative 8. Example K, negative 10 divided by negative 10. 10 divided by 10 is 1. And just like with multiplications, we can cancel out any pairs of negatives. And so my final answer is positive 1. All right, the last two, this is just to review our rules about division and the number 0. Negative 12 divided by 0. Is this one allowed? Remember that this one is undefined. You cannot have a denominator of 0. You are not allowed to divide by 0. This is saying 0 times what gives you negative 12, and that cannot be done. And the last problem, 0 divided by negative 5. Well, remember that 0 divided by anything is 0. And so 0 divided by negative 5 is 0. All right, so that takes care of some examples involving basic multiplications and divisions. The last thing I want to look at is just to kind of challenge ourselves. Let's just combine multiplication and division together. So our procedure in order to solve these problems, the first thing we want to do is simplify inside the parentheses. Remember, when we talk about simplifying inside, that means if we have operations, either multiplications or divisions, inside parentheses, we need to do those first. And then remember, we talked about this in the last module. Multiplication and division must be done from left to right. All right, so let's look at some examples. Example A, we have 6 times negative 10 divided by negative 3 times 2. So if we go ahead and do this, we get 6 times negative 10. I want to simplify inside my parentheses first, and we get negative 3 times 2 is negative 6. From there, I want to multiply from left to right. Multiply and divide from left to right. So we get 6 times negative 10 is negative 60. Divide by negative 6. and we get 10. It is going to be a positive 10 because my negatives cancel. And actually, you could have done this at the very beginning. If we cancel the two original negatives, then note that there are no negatives running around, so our final answer is going to be positive. So let's use that technique for example B. So for example B, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of any extra negatives that we don't need. So it doesn't matter, but basically you can cancel any two negatives that are in this problem. We do not have any parentheses that count as parentheses in this problem. Can you simplify 4? No, 4 is just 4. So the parentheses here actually just mean multiplication. So now we want to go ahead and go from left to right. 24 divided by 2 is 12. 12 times 4 is 48. And 48 divided by negative 6 is negative 8. All right, let's try a couple more. Let's look at example C. Again, I'm going to cancel any negatives that we don't need. So I'm going to cancel 2 negatives. And I'm going to note that I do have 1 left over, so I know my answer is going to be negative. All right, so if we go ahead and start our division, we want to go from left to right. So 50 divided by 5 is 10. 10 divided by 2 is 5. We have 1 negative. We keep it. All right, example D. Remember that we need to multiply and divide from left to right. So I'm going to start with 60 divided by... Sorry, I forgot to cancel my negatives first. Let's go ahead and do that. My answer will be positive since both of our negatives cancel. So now if we go ahead and divide, we get 60 divided by 3 is 20. We already got rid of the negative, so we just want to multiply 20 times 5, and we get 100. All right, last two problems. Let's start off by canceling negatives. Again, you can cancel any negatives that you want. We're just going to do it in pairs. So my answer, I have 1 negative left over. My answer will be negative. All right, so if we go ahead and do this, we get 6 times. We're going to simplify inside the parentheses first. If you want, you can keep that negative there. Now if we go ahead and multiply from left to right, we get 6 times negative 2 is negative 12. Times 2 is negative 24. All right, last example. We don't have anything here that counts as parentheses. We cannot simplify 10, we cannot simplify negative 3, so these both signify multiplication. So remember that we do want to multiply and divide from left to right. So we're going to start on the left. Negative 8 times 10 is negative 80. We'll bring down everything else. Negative 80 divided by 4 is negative 20. Negative 20 times negative 3 is positive 60. Note that I almost put a negative there. That's one of the reasons that I like taking care of the negatives in the beginning. That way I don't have to worry about them as I'm doing my computations. And then finally 60 divided by negative 6 is negative 10. Now, as I almost made a mistake in my computation, let's just make sure that we have the right sign for our answer. I can cancel two negatives. I have one left over, so that does check out. All right, so that takes care of multiplication and division. The next section that we're going to look at is order of operations, and so make sure that you're clear on your rules for adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing, because we are going to be bringing them all together in the next section. Go ahead, take a break, and then we'll come back later.